asymmetric information assumes that managers have better information than the marketplace. Therefore, they would sell stock if the stock is overvalued, and they sell bonds if the stock is undervalued. So this is another reason, a theory that explains why managers do what they do. So essentially, the implication is this, and again, there is empirical evidence this is true. This research was developed by Gordon Donaldson, actually surveyed chief financial officers. There's some academics drive me crazy because, well, let's spend 8 years developing these econometric models to find out what's going on. And Donald says, why don't we just ask the CFOs, why are they doing what are they doing? And that's what he did. So he went out and talked to his 850 chief financial officers and asked them, how do you finance? Why do you do what you do? And what he found is that the first place they look for capital is internal funds, retained funds. The second place they go is they'll draw on marketable securities, then debt, and only as a last resort will they issue new stock. So all this, what does it mean? There is an optimal target for every organization that benefits the costs and the benefits, that balances the cost and the benefits of debt financing. Unfortunately, we cannot tell what that place is. And as well, it changes over time. And everything we've talked about, with the exception of the tax rate, of course, but even to not-for-profit businesses, almost everything we've talked about is relevant. I mean, there is no hospital anywhere that's financed entirely with debt. Typically, it's 30, 40, 50% in their capital structure. And the reason is because there are benefits to debt financing. There's tax-exempt debt. But there's also the cost, which is hospitals start to reach 70, 80% debt in the capital structure. They really do risk financial distress. So what happens in the long run and in the real world, what affects the amount of capital structure? Long-run viability. What does that mean? Why would the long-run viability affect the capital structure?
Maybe because if you feel as a firm that you're secure, then you might be willing to take on more debt. So you might be willing to make a more risky decision now if you know that your earnings, your projected earnings into the future are secure or will maintain a certain level.
Okay, so that's a good answer. So let's turn it around. If I am concerned about the long-run viability of my organization, what will I likely not do?
Probably won't issue equity, or maybe not, I don't know.
Sorry?
I don't know. I would say that you wouldn't want to issue too many stocks. You wouldn't want to have too much. You want to finance with debt over equity. No, I don't know.
Well, which is riskier, debt or equity? So if you're concerned about the long-run viability,
You want to use too much debt.
you're probably not going to use as much debt as your organization could handle, possibly. Which leads to the second, which is managerial conservatism. Investors are usually fully diversified in their portfolios. They have no problem with lots of organizations taking on debt. But managers are more conservative typically than the investors because they've got a lot of their career invested in the organization. They are less likely to make debt decisions that threaten the organization than perhaps their investors would want them to. Lender rating agency attitudes, what does that mean? Why would that affect capital structure?
There's certain recommended levels for certain ratings that affect their ability to get a good pricing on debt.
Right, so what's being said is that different types of bond ratings have got different levels of debt in the capital structure. So if you increase the amount of debt in your capital structure, you may reduce your bond rating, which reduces the cost of capital and other and has other costs associated with it. Reserve borrowing capacity, I'm going to just quickly finish these up because we're after 3, means essentially that managers will never fully exploit the amount of debt they can borrow because they always like to have a reserve borrowing capacity. In other words, they want to make sure they got a pile of money for rainy days in case unexpected opportunities come up. Industry averages sound like it shouldn't matter, like what do I care what the industry average is, but investors pay attention to it. So if the average hospital that I invest in has got 60% debt in its capital structure and you've got 80, that makes me worried. I don't know why. All I know is that you're different from the average. And so the managers will know that and they'll pay attention to industry average. Control. Why is control affected? Why would capital structure be affected by control?
Because when you use debt, you're not losing control, but when you are selling equity, you're losing part of the control of your business.
Exactly. So what he said is when you use debt, essentially the managers retain control, or the investors retain control of the firm. They're not sharing control of the firm with the debt holders. But when they issue equity, then essentially you're diluting control of the firm. So sometimes, this is true with startups in particular, the decision to issue debt or the capital structure is often influenced by the desire of the owners to retain control of the organization. The asset structure, organizations got more buildings and equipment are more likely to have debt. Organizations that are growing quickly are more likely to have to go outside for capital. They'll be less able to rely on internally generated funds. Profitability for the same reason, and then taxes. Organizations that pay high tax rates are more likely to borrow because there's a bigger tax shield. I refer to that. So that is the Nobel Prize theory in 90 minutes. 675 minutes, sorry. Any comments or questions at this point in time about? I'm happy to go over any slide that I've gone through.
Yeah, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
With the trade-off theory, you said firms should borrow more if they employ tangible assets versus intangible. Why is that again?
This one?
Yeah.
Because if you've got tangible assets, you can pledge the assets against, you can borrow against the assets. With intangible assets, there's nothing that can be sold, nothing physical that can be sold. So typically hospitals, which have got buildings and equipment, borrow more than home health agencies, which have got, really their only assets are the people who work for them. Other comments, questions?
So what are the implications for a not-for-profit firm in terms of, I mean, if tax shield is not really a factor?
In terms of the benefits?
Right.
So are you asking why would a not-for-profit issue debt?
No, and not for that, because you just explained, asset structure, but, I don't know. I don't really know how to phrase my question. Maybe I'll come back to it.
Is what you're asking, let me see if I can phrase your question. What you're asking is, these models seem to be heavily oriented toward investor-owned organizations and are the same basic concepts and principles of profit.
Yeah.
I think they are relevant, not as directly relevant. I mean, the reality is that UNC Healthcare does not get a tax advantage. There is no tax shield for UNC Healthcare when it issues debt. So there is no TD. But they get to leverage, they have the same leverage ability. They can have higher rate of return on equity with debt than they do without debt. So there are benefits to UNC Healthcare or any not-for-profit to acquiring more and more debt. Do you accept that? Okay, so if we accept that premise, then at some point UNC Healthcare will have 70-80% debt in its capital structure. And at that point, if Chris Ellington isn't getting worried, I'd be very surprised. He'll be getting worried about the imminent financial distress from having so much debt in the capital structure. So the basic principles are the same, it's just that the metrics are a little different. In other words, to sum up, I have no doubt that the boards and management teams of not-for-profit hospitals weigh advantages and disadvantages, the costs and the benefits of additional debt in every capital structure decision they make. You just don't say, okay, let's issue 300 million more bonds, and then say that's it. That's not what happened. Because having that $300 million increases the financial risk of the organization and increases the likelihood of the possibility of financial distress. I've got 200-300 hospitals I can show you who are worrying right now about that a lot. Other comments, questions?
Can you explain more of like just looking at the number that you get when you calculate the value of the firm, what that inherently means, and then that the relationship of that number to the price of your stock?
In theory, if M&M's models are accurate, the value of the levered firm divided by the number of shares is the price per share that you would see traded on the market. So let's try these 3 quick questions. Is that true or false? It's true. A firm with low business risk is more likely to have debt than a firm with high business risk. Which of those things would encourage a firm to increase the amount of debt in its capital structure? C, because there is a tax benefit to debt. So Congress has passed legislation that increases the personal tax rate but decreases the corporate tax rate. This would encourage companies to increase their debt rate. Is that true or false? False. Higher the tax rate, more incentive corporations have to issue debt. Okay, the in-class problem today, I'm going to ask you, I think it's too complicated to do on your own.